Hello and welcome to our webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on mobility in Central Ohio, a panel discussion. This is the fourth in a series of webinars aimed at cities and regions in the post-coronavirus era, initiating community conversations on what lessons we can learn from this crisis to create a more resilient and sustainable world. My name is Katie Phillips, and I am the Outreach Coordinator at the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis, otherwise known as CURA. I will be your host for this event. Please feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar in the Q&A box. We will ask as many of your questions as we can in the last portion of the panel discussion, and if we do not get to your question, we apologize. If you have any additional questions following this event, please feel free to email me at phillips.1870@osu.edu. There will also be a short survey at the end of this webinar. If you have time, please provide your feedback. I'm going to kick it over to our moderator for this event, CURA's Director, Harvey Miller.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us once again for our seminar series on the impact of coronavirus on cities and regions. As Katie mentioned, this is the fourth in our series, and we will be continuing this series through the fall, through December. And then we'll be switching to our regular programming in the spring, which our theme will be Legacy Cities. And this is something we originally planned for this fall, but we pushed off to the spring so that we can create this webinar series to address some of the issues facing Central Ohio, and cities everywhere in this global pandemic. Our next event in this series will be on Friday, September 18th at noon. And the theme then will be the impacts of COVID-19 on food security, with long-term implications and adaptations. And we'll be featuring Kip Curtis, who's an associate professor in the Department of History here at Ohio State, Mary Rodriguez, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Agriculture, Communication, Education, and Leadership at OSU, Brian Snyder, who's executive director of INFACT, which is the Food and Agricultural Transformation program here at Ohio State, and Lauren Vargo, who's a program director of the Ohio Produce Perks and Fresh Link Ambassador program at Case Western University in Cleveland, Ohio. That'll be Friday, September 18th. Please register for the event, even if you can't make it at the time. If you register, we'll send you a link with a recording so you can watch later. And that's also true for this event. So before we get started, we'd like to pause and acknowledge the Shawnee, Miami, Lapani, Delaware, and Wyandot peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Central Ohio. We are grateful for opportunities to work with the indigenous peoples in this place. And as a land-grant university, we honor and respect the indigenous peoples connected to the site of our institution. Now, I'd like to start by introducing our panelists. First, Erin Sink, who's the Director of Government Relations for LNE Group, an international government affairs and consulting firm based in Ohio. She serves on the board of directors of Yay Bikes, a local bike advocacy and education organization that works to help people feel comfortable and enjoy riding bikes for transportation and recreation in Central Ohio. And Erin is a year-round bike commuter. Thanks for joining us, Erin.
Thank you.
We also have Kimberly Sharp, who's the Senior Director of Development at the Central Ohio Transit Authority, or CODA. And she was previously the Westerville Deputy Director of Planning and Development from 2013 to 2019, and also was the Flagstaff, Arizona Comprehensive Planning Manager from 2005 to 2013. She holds a BS in Architecture and Master's in Regional Planning from Virginia Commonwealth University. And a degree from OSU, is that correct, Kimberly? I may have got that wrong.
Architecture from OSU.
Oh, good. Okay, we always love having Buckeyes on. Justin Goodwin, who's the Transportation Planning Manager for the City of Columbus and has over 12 years of combined experience in both the public and private sectors. Justin is dedicated to improving community livability by applying best practices in transportation planning and urban design with a focus on creating safe, economically productive, multimodal streets and mobility options. Thanks for joining us, Justin. Also scheduled to join us is Stephen Patchen, He's not with us yet, but we hope he'll jump in at any time. He's currently the Assistant Director of Planning and Sustainability at the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, where he oversees sustainable transportation initiatives such as MORPC's Insight 2050 Technical Assistance Program, Central Ohio Safety Program, Active Transportation Committee, and Active Transportation Plan Update. And we hope he'll join us at any time. But first, we'll start with some opening statements from the panelists, and we'll do it in the order of Aaron, Kimberly, and Justin. Aaron, please.
So thanks for having me. I think this is a fantastic forum to convene because like so many things, COVID-19 has changed our world and the way we're operating in it. Mobility is a big piece of people's lives, what they do day to day, how they meet their needs. And so I think it's really great to have so many folks on here thinking about how we move forward from what we've learned from this and what we're going to be able to build coming out of it that'll be better for the long term.
And I think it's me.
Yes, it is. Sorry, Kimberly. Go ahead.
CODA, as the mobility solutions provider in Central Ohio, the transit provider, we know that this is a really important system, an intersystem to many people in the community, and the effects of COVID have taught us a lot, especially how we assess data and use data on a daily basis to understand what's going on in the community, how we gather that, disseminate it, and then work with our internal staff and operators, bus drivers, to really be there for the community and to really focus services where they're needed the most. And we've learned a lot about the community and about ourselves, and we're very proud of our partnerships and proud of providing services to the core of the community. And you wanted us to kind of wrap up what we've learned about ourselves. I forget the second part of that comment.
Oh, just some opening remarks, just to start off our discussion. Whatever you want to say.
Yeah, just, we're all still getting around. We still meet when we can, and a lot of people are working from home and still going down to the offices. McKinley and Fields are still hopping. Our bus operators cannot work from home. They are definitely out in the field. They are our first responders. They're out there in the front lines, and we're really proud of our staff, and we're really proud of our operators.
Excellent, thank you. Justin, your opening comments, please.
Well, really quickly, I happen to know that Stephen is trying to join. He's having some technical issues. So Katie, perhaps you could see if you can help him there. Thanks, Harvey. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I think it's going to be a good one. It's obviously timely. So much of all of our conversations have been revolving around how to react to the pandemic and what the immediate impacts are and what the long-term impacts are going to be. Certainly, we're seeing very obvious effects on our transportation system, but it's really hitting all aspects of our society, right? I think the interesting thing is we were already at a sort of a turning point in the city of Columbus. This is a transformational moment in how we're looking ahead to the future of our transportation system in the city, and our partnership with CODA and with MORPC on a newly launched mobility corridors initiative called Link Us that we've been spending a lot of our time, Kim and myself in particular, working very closely together to rethink how we invest in our mobility infrastructure for the 21st century. Likewise, our department, the Department of Public Service, has launched this spring, and in fact, it was the week before the shutdown happened, our Vision Zero Columbus initiative. So the timing was unfortunate, as it didn't get a whole lot of press right there because it was overtaken by what was happening with COVID hitting. But this is also transformational in setting this ambitious goal of eliminating all severe and fatal traffic-related crashes with a focus on vulnerable roadway users and with an equity focus in serving those in areas of our city who maybe haven't benefited from transportation investments over the past number of decades. And so we're undertaking those among other major initiatives right now. We were already doing those things, and the challenges posed by the pandemic on how we think about mobility, I think, are just underscoring the importance of these new approaches to thinking about a transportation system.
Okay, thank you, Justin. And Stephen, you joined us just in time. Perfect.
Sorry about that.
It's okay, it happens. So we already introduced you, so we're just starting with the opening comments. So just just your general view on communities, mobility, and COVID and its impacts.
Sure.
What do you say?
Again, I'm Stephen Patch, I'm Assistant Director at MORPC. The COVID-19 impacts that we're seeing are really, one of the interesting things is how that's impacting walking and biking. The retail biking industry is seeing a really big increase in sales. So that's saying that there's a demand there for walking and biking. We're seeing recreationally, but I think also for other errands and that sort of thing. So how that continues when people go back to office and kids go to school, that's yet to be seen. So, it's going to be really interesting to see the trends that come out of this and continue on in this new normal that we're anticipating. So, yeah, those are my opening remarks, but I'm sure I'll have other ones as we go.
I'm sure you will. And that actually is a good segue into my first question for the entire panel. How has COVID affected mobility in Central Ohio? And especially, what are the differential impacts we're seeing across modes, neighborhoods, and communities? And let's start with Aaron.
Sorry about that. I think first what we've seen is that in general, traffic volumes took a pretty deep plunge. First from a stay-at-home order, then a dip in the economy that's affected workers' jobs, and this pretty substantial shift that happened real fast for a lot of computer-based office jobs suddenly being remote and seeming to continue to be at least in part remote. And I think one of the side effects that OSU even put out some information on this was that those lower traffic volumes can entice higher speeds without the volume and congestion that slow traffic down. So that has rippling effects that go out across different riders, users of those roads. We've also seen a dip in ridership. So both, I think, those same driving factors, but also this desire to be more physically separated from other people. So that's affecting people's travel decisions, what modes they might use. And I'm going to harken back to what Stephen said on the bikes. So nationally and locally, bikes are just flying off store shelves. So we're definitely seeing a surge there, both for recreation and transportation. And so, I think part of that, it's a naturally distant mode. It's a very affordable option. I think as people felt cooped up, they wanted to be outside. Those lower vehicle volumes may have made it feel like there's more space for users who were concerned about being close to cars. And then if you're doing a greater proportion of your travels community-based and close to home, what we know at Yay Bikes, and we talk about this a lot, is that a trip you're making that is 4 miles or less is a really ideal candidate to make by bike. And so we are seeing so many of these folks who have discovered or rediscovered biking. We believe that a portion of them will keep that up both over the winter months and then come back to it in the spring. And so we're thinking about how do we capture and encourage that as a mode shift, and getting people out of single occupancy vehicles has been a priority, I think, for all of our organizations across the region as we're looking at Columbus's long-term trajectory and growth as a region. And then I think one of the big things that we've seen is that COVID-19 in so many ways continues to heighten disparities and highlight them. And so if you were struggling with mobility before COVID, you're probably still struggling with mobility, and it may even be harder for a number of reasons. And so we're trying to figure out, as those workers who are essential, maybe low wage, their wages are impacted, they're still having to go into work every day, and they may not be having the same options or may have other priorities helping drive them as well. So I think those are the questions that we're looking to answer quickly. And from Yay Bikes, we think bikes are a big part of that solution for some of those local trips, especially in these beautiful summer months.
Okay, thank you. Kimberly, this has had a big impact on CODA, and a lot of your, ridership are transit-dependent people. Can you speak to that, what the impacts have been on them?
Sure. So pre-COVID, CODA hosted about 60,000 rides a day. And starting in mid-March, watching the numbers drop, we watched the daily ridership drop. We were watching Governor DeWine's orders. We were in constant companies, our business associates and community partners, trying to understand the commuter patterns and trying to understand traffic patterns and trying to make decisions, because we knew we really needed to do two things. We needed to put into place safety measures for our bus operators and the public, and we needed to really focus service for where it was needed the most. So with the stay-at-home orders, a great majority of the downtown office workers, the telecommuting shrunk to nearly nothing, so the commuter express lines were the first to be suspended. At the same time, we focused the services on the core, line 10, line 1, line 2, and those are still seeing, we are averaging right now around 21,000 rides per day. Of course, the safety measures put into place, the maximum 20 people per bus, face masks required by both riders and operators. Lots of things put into place to try to protect everyone, but still people need transit to get to work. So we're doing the daily monitoring, and we're really focusing on connecting people to essential services, such as food banks, schools that are serving lunches to school children, essential employment centers such as hospitals, and we're actually seeing where the jobs are growing. They're growing in particular areas where we're now getting ready to add more service out into the system in September, and specifically where it's needed the most. We really appreciate the community partners such as Goodwill and YMCA and Jobs and Family Services for helping us understand the needs and understand different innovative ways to reach and help the community. So these adjustments included adding some early morning service, and we're improving some frequency, but mostly we've learned a lot about ourselves and how we use information and how we utilize our community partners. So with that, we're very excited about the future, and we're here to be a part and to help the community.
Thank you. So Justin, you're in charge of transportation planning for the city of Columbus, so you have a very community-wide perspective and also a very multimodal perspective.
Yeah.
Let's zoom out a bit and talk about that.
Yeah. Well, I think both Aaron and Kim have given a pretty comprehensive overview of the various trends that we've been seeing over the past number of months. One in particular that Aaron mentioned that I just wanted to touch on a little bit more, the disparate impact on certain segments of our communities, particularly those who do rely on transit, who are working essential jobs and can't telecommute, and that CODA continues to serve. Those are disproportionately people who are in minority neighborhoods. It's the Black and brown communities that have already suffered a lot of impacts from systemic racism, from policy decisions over decades in our built environment, specifically in our transportation system, as well as in our land use and zoning policies that have exacerbated a lot of issues and have resulted in health risks already that are now being compounded by COVID-19. So there are all of these impacts upon impacts. And I think it may be a bit of a stretch to call this a silver lining, but an opportunity here is that this pandemic has highlighted that. And I think all of us in the transportation world have been certainly aware of these disparate impacts on transportation infrastructure for a long time, but now it's out in the broader conversation. It's being talked about in mainstream media, and it's put all of us in a position where we can advance, honest conversations about how we need to think differently about our transportation system, about our mobility infrastructure improvements, about how we're prioritizing different modes, and making sure that we're investing in a transportation system that's going to equitably serve everyone in our community. I mean, these are all hard, heavy challenges to deal with, but this is the time. As I said when I opened remarks, we were already moving in a transformational direction, thinking about our transportation system, and the equity needs around this are even more important now. And I think that's a really critical lens that we think about as we move forward in responding to this crisis.
Good, thank you. Now, Stephen, Morpsey has a bigger footprint than the city of Columbus. So talk about what you're seeing in the region.
Well, that's a really good question. And I think to start off, I wanted to weave together a little bit of narrative based off of what I'm hearing. With walking and with biking in particular, nationwide, we can guess that probably our region has what the interested but concerned potential cyclists, we'll call them, probably about 30 to 40% of our region, people fall in that. The thing that keeps people from biking is that we don't have a network. We don't have infrastructure for walking, well, for biking, and even walking we run into it. So we can't accommodate those people. The other piece of that, of all of our regional trips are half of them are less than 5 miles. Commenting on what Aaron said, 4 miles is a feasible, reasonable trip on a bike. So if half of our region is taking less than 5 miles, excuse me, and then another 35% of that is less than 3 miles, weaving all that together, if we had a full network, what would our bicycling ridership numbers look like? That's what we're kind of exploring now. And that was before COVID. Now, after COVID, where there are even fewer people driving because there's a lot more stay at home, there's still that demand for the transit system, which walking and biking are supplemental to, feeding into that. We're seeing some opportunities. We don't want this crisis to go to waste if we can reevaluate what's happening in our region and start to right-size our infrastructure accordingly to current and future trends that we're forecasting. We could do some really innovative, interesting things that could benefit our environment, benefit our air quality, make our region more economically equitable and socially equitable. So I think it's obviously a really hard time for a myriad of reasons, but I think it's also an exciting time for us to sort of reevaluate what was wrong in the past. And this gives us a chance to really kind of level set all of that and move forward with some new strategies, some new funding opportunities, that sort of thing. So to kind of paint some optimism around this whole COVID-19, that's kind of what we're looking at.
Okay, let's follow up on that a little bit more. Rahm Emanuel famously once said, "You never want a serious crisis go to waste. It's an opportunity to do things that you think we couldn't do before." And I've heard that so far in this conversation. So I'd like to pick up on that theme. What do you think we should be doing right now, given this moment, this unfortunate moment, but an opportunity to rethink our mobility systems? Aaron, why don't we start with you?
One of the things that's happened is people have adapted to big change really quickly, and they're making them a big part of their everyday lives. We're also seeing people be very creative in how they're solving problems that may have existed before and under this new paradigm. So while we have this, motor vehicle volumes are down, there's less pressure perhaps from that constituency that we could use to reimagine some things, that equity that Stephen was talking about. So other cities like Boston and Minneapolis have closed some streets to motor vehicle traffic to make space for recreation, or some have had success with closing some streets for small businesses and make room for patio space. So those are just examples of things that we're seeing. that, this moment could be a great moment to try something like that. It could be an opportunity to bring in new partners or constituencies that may have been resistant to efforts before about getting people out of single occupancy vehicles and reducing parking. And I think the opportunity and challenge there around doing it is this equitable, this theme around equity that we've been talking about, is how do you do that in a way that different neighborhoods have a say in the innovative strategy you're using, whether it's permanent or temporary. And how do we prioritize then those needs? So those, one neighborhood, Linden may have a very different priority than say Clintonville or Dublin. And so making sure that we're tagging those strategies, those tests, those new, whatever initiative that is to what that need is, and engaging them in the conversation. And, when we can't all meet in person, sometimes those community engagement conversations are difficult to really do in an equitable way. And so I think that's something at Yay Bikes we are trying to figure out. We used to do a lot of education one-on-one, found it was the best way. So we're trying to think about how do we reach that, bike curious person who may be interested now in making a small grocery store trip with a bike, and giving them the tools that they need. So I think those are the types of things that I hope we use this moment while we've got some windows open to move.
Great. So Kim, how can we reimagine public transit? And again, thinking big. What can you see here? What should we be doing?
So a couple of things come to mind. I think this is our community's opportunity to understand what equitable access to mobility options mean. It doesn't mean every development project needs enough parking. We can really rethink that and understand that from a very core sense. And it's also our opportunity to understand who is our workforce and where are they coming from, and how do we move people around to get them to jobs in a way that just makes sense for everybody, the business, the workforce, the educational facilities, training our workforce. We can really rethink that and start working on a more equitable access to mobility options overall. So thinking big, I'll go back to something that Justin started off with, and that is the Corridors Initiative, the Link Us Corridors Initiative, which has been in discussion for many years through the Corridor Concepts and Insight 2050, thanks to MORPC and ULI Columbus and other partners. That's big thinking about a higher capacity transit system, a system that can move a lot more people a lot quicker. And how do we have a transit system that, of course, could be faster than your commute when people start driving again? And is that even the way we want to go about it? Meaning commuting by car. And what does that mean for our job growth and job development? So it's really understanding this is all a system. We're not just about putting buses out on the road. We're about growing the community holistically. We're a partner in that. And what does that growth mean? What does resiliency mean? It's how a lot of people can get to where they need to go in an equitable fashion.
Glad you mentioned Insights 2050 and the Link Us initiative. I want to come back to that in a moment, but first I want to wrap up this question by going back to Stephen and talking about, well, we've heard about like biking in the city, we've heard about public transit, but of course MORPC, goes beyond even Franklin County. So how do we create a regional system where we can connect some of these outlying communities to our city going forward?
I really think it comes down to transit's going to be just the foundation for all of this, especially for our communities that are, in the outskirts of the MORPC area in Central Ohio. The economics of the COVID-19 pandemic are the nadir of where that is all going is still yet to be seen. And about 25% of our households in the region either don't have a car or have one car. And many of those are car burden economically. So with additional economic burdens on them, losing jobs, taking pay cuts, pay freezes, that sort of thing, can't afford that car. And if you can't afford that car, transit's got to be that thing there. And if it's not transit, if you're closer to work and play, biking and walking, you got to have infrastructure for both biking and walking that prioritizes safety. And that's intuitive to anyone who gets on a bike. You can tell as soon as you get on a bike and you get on a bike lane or bike infrastructure, you can tell how much the people who built that prioritized your safety. It's a no-brainer. So until we have networks where anyone of any age, any mobility can go anywhere, anytime, we're severely capping the potential for biking and walking. And as a result, potential for transit as well, because people walk and bike, the more they can walk and bike to transit, the more successful that will be. So it's kind of it's all integrated, a lot of intersections there.
Okay, thank you. So let's come back to Insights 2050. So that's recently evolved into Linkus that's being pursued here in Central Ohio, starting with the Northwest Corridor between Columbus and Dublin. So that's an attempt to create transit-oriented development and assuming that that's the way people want to live, denser in a way that's accessible to public transit and other forms of mobility. So how is COVID changing your thinking about this, or is this something we're still going to pursue in the same way? Justin and Kimberly, obviously, but let's start with Justin.
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked the question, Harvey. The answer is unequivocally no. It is not changing our fundamental thinking. And in fact, I'll use the words of Council President Shannon Hardin, all the more reason that with this crisis to lean in to this strategy. For some of the reasons that Stephen mentioned, these economic impacts that are still unfolding, and we don't know exactly how everything's going to shake out in the housing market, in the jobs market. We do know people are already being very severely economically impacted. We have to start thinking differently about how we ensure opportunity for everybody that lives in our community. And that means people having those options for how they do get to work and having affordable places to live as well. And so the Link Us initiative, and as Kim mentioned, it's an outgrowth of many foundational planning efforts, many of which MORPC has been very instrumental in with the Insight 2050 and Corridor Concepts work. And, this is building on those efforts as an implementation and an action plan. We're taking the long view, and this is going to unfold over many years. We have every intent to move quickly towards implementation, but we're talking about major scale infrastructure, mobility infrastructure improvements, high capacity transit, but also it's not just transit, it's bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, it's quality of place in design to ensure safety, as Stephen is mentioning, and how that infrastructure integrates with development opportunity along these corridors, like the Northwest Corridor, and I'm sure Kim will maybe want to mention the next corridor that's going to be pursued as well, to create a system. So, MORPC has made it pretty clear. I think a lot of people in Central Ohio now know that we're projected to become a region of 3 million people over the next 20 some years. Those people have to live somewhere and they've got to get around somehow. And fundamentally, cities are still cities. And, we've seen market pendulum swings. That's how it works. And the pendulum's a little erratic right now, but we've had 50 years of the pendulum swinging towards suburban sprawl. In the past couple of decades, especially the last one, has been moving back towards walkable urbanism and sort of rediscovering all of those great qualities of good walkable cities that incorporate quality transit and all the other benefits that come with that. And we know that we can't, for the city of Columbus, we can't continue to outwardly sprawl. That's not a sustainable growth pattern. So there are environmental considerations, there are fiscal sustainability considerations, and then again, the equitable access to opportunity objectives that we have to grow differently and we have to move people around differently. And I guess the last point I would make is, thinking about all the conversations happening nationally about the balance of stay at home, social distancing, get the virus under control versus don't shatter the economy, right? And these trade-off considerations. So there are viewpoints out there that maintaining the economy is maybe even more important than immediately responding to the virus. I'm not saying I support that, but I think if that's a valid viewpoint that some can have, then I would say it's equally as valid to say investing in dense, urban, walkable, transit supportive development is also just as important as responding to this hopefully near-term and temporary crisis. So eventually we will get the virus under control, and we still have all of these other important community objectives and needs that we have to address. And, you know, I think if we would just focus on some near-term behavior change to deal with the virus and keep our eye on the prize for the long-term transformational things that we need to be focused on, then we're going to be better off in the long run.
Okay, good, thank you. So Kim, tell us the perspective about the these corridors from Coda's view. I mean, Enrique, I think it was Enrique Penalosa who said, an advanced civilization is not where the poor own cars, but where everyone rides buses or something like that. Is that what you're imagining for these corridors as we go forward, and how will we achieve that?
I think I'm imagining a resilient Central Ohio community that's based upon opportunities for everybody and choices. Choices of how you get around, choices of your housing, and choices of jobs. And I think that the resiliency of our community with this long-term thinking, there's a lot of things we got to deal with here and now, we know that. But the long-term thinking is, you know, having those choices. And the focus of the corridors is increasing some choices we currently don't have. And so that we have more choice in the future, more choice of how we get around in the housing and jobs. And I know, so regarding the corridors themselves, it doesn't always mean buses. It's really about mobility choices. And if there ends up being different modes that interact with each other, different modes that interact with each other in really exciting, interesting places where development happens. I know we talked about the term, the 15-minute city. That's kind of becoming cool, but it's not so new. If you can, you know, it's a little bit of Jane Jacobs mixed with some Garden City concepts, but it's really about, as more people just want to be able to be closer to their jobs. I think that's what we're learning from the pandemic, is people are comfortable telecommuting when they can, but even when they can't, they want, and really, what are your opportunities in close proximity? So I think the vision is there's a mobility system that could be different modes interacting that make all of those opportunities and choices easier for people to make. So I will talk about the East-West corridor briefly. Justin's focusing on the Northwest corridor with all of us as part of the team. Coda is now getting ready to launch into the East-West high-capacity transit corridor plan. So that's taking off where we left off with the corridor concepts and really focusing on how this will work from the community from one end of 270 and beyond to the other end, and really understanding the neighborhoods, what positive impacts are possible, and how to connect with the rest of the system in a way that opens up those opportunities.
Okay, thank you. I was just going to post a Linkist thing to the chat so the viewers can discover that, and I'll just do that right now. And then I want to pick up on that idea about 15-minute cities, because that's something that's gaining much more currency right now. Because several mayors, the mayors of Austin, Boston, Chicago, New Orleans, and other cities have actually decided to pursue this concept of 15-minute city, where cities are composed of neighborhoods where all residents can meet their needs within a short walk or bicycle ride. And they're pledging this as explicitly as a way to recover from the COVID pandemic. So how do we achieve this in Central Ohio, and how do we get there? Let's start with Steve.
Land use is a big obstacle in that for the region, because there are pockets where 15-minute cities works really well. And there are larger pockets in the rural areas there where that's a challenge. So, but we are growing, as Justin mentioned, we are growing. And so to have a more focused growth, which the Insight 2050 study recommends and illustrates can happen, then those 15-minute cities, 15-minute Columbus and Central Ohio and all the other cities around us that can happen. So, and I like the 15-minute cities because that's something that's digestible. It's not planaries. It's not wonky. It's not, oh, I have to measure. How many of my trips are less than 5 miles? That's a little bit harder to answer as to how many of my trips are less than 15 minutes. People can answer that much easier, and we can measure that much easier if they want to survey folks and that sort of thing. So it's, as Kim mentioned, it's been around, but it's nice to see it kind of reanimated and being put into the discussion. But again, I think where our Central Ohio has different makeup as far as land use and density, and the further we get out, and the destinations are a little bit more further away, transit again, micro mobility, that sort of thing. E-bikes are becoming more and more popular. And an e-bike, you can easily do that 7-mile trip on an e-bike in that way. But also, and really, finally, the culture has to change. It's not just about infrastructure. And when I say culture, if I want to bike to a grocery store, I shouldn't have to worry about getting my groceries home. And that's something with service-wise and culturally that grocery stores and other services and retail like that accommodate folks who bike there, get their goods home in some way, or promote biking or in the micromobility vehicles that can accommodate that sort of thing. So there's still some innovations, still some cultural things that need to occur so we can really capitalize on all these opportunities.
So you mentioned businesses in that regard, like having businesses be more bike friendly and accommodate cyclists and things like that.
Yeah.
Maybe Aaron can comment now on what other features do we need in our neighborhood? I mean, obviously things like bike share, protected bike lanes, but what else has to occur in our communities and neighborhoods to achieve this 15-minute city?
I'll start on the bikes and maybe go a little bit bigger from that. So some of the things just that, when people ask me about how do you actually do that? How do you go to the grocery store? It's education, right? So there are lots of tools and tricks. What kind of carrying mechanisms do you need on a bike? But there's also things as simple as, where is there bike parking? Where is there a place to lock my bike that I can find it? And so, many times I'll go to a business and find they have bike parking, but it's tucked away in the back alley somewhere. And so it's not obvious. And so I think part of it is creating that welcoming environment. I'll just kind of use downtown Columbus has these big, beautiful bike racks all over town. They're covered, they're green, they're really interesting, eye-catching pieces, and they create a space for bikes. They tell you immediately that bikes belong here. And so those are some kind of strategies for businesses to look at when they want to encourage people to bike to their facilities, is to making that sort of easy. But I want to harken back to something said before, like we have to align our levers, right? So we have all these different levers that we can pull. Land use is a big one. I'm going to say incentives and subsidies that we have need to be aligned to those same goals. So our zoning code, our abatement and incentive structures, our transportation policy and planning structures, all of these need to be aligned toward that goal. And it requires not just great planning behind it, but it also requires some political will to do it, right? Because these types of changes, when you stack them all together, it's a pretty big transformation. And so we have to be really thoughtful and intentional about those changes, but we have to be willing to create some waves with it, and realize that it will disrupt the current status quo, but disruption's not always a bad thing. Scooters coming to the Central Ohio scene was a very disruptive moment, but I think it's been for the better in the long run, as it was clearly meeting an unmet mobility need. And you saw that with the quick adoption of them and how they continue to be used in multiple neighborhoods, and meeting some of that multi-mobility first mile, last mile challenges that we talk about a lot. So I think that idea of aligning all those tools and levers toward those goals is really probably the most important thing in achieving that. And I guess the last thing I'll say is also meeting those different neighborhoods and communities where they are. So some have lots of those destination places that we all need: grocery stores, hardware stores, libraries, medical facilities. Others have real deficits, but may have a street structure that lends itself more to walking. Don't have either. And so we've got to pair those together. It's not just a transportation solution. It's, you know, all of the above in making that a reality.
So it seems like everyone agrees with you. I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads right here, and I think we all agree. But let me ask about what are the barriers and challenges that we're facing here in Central Ohio? I mean, we see other cities making these moves, and not just big cities like Boston and San Francisco, but Grand Rapids, Michigan, and Cincinnati, Ohio. So what are the particular blockers that we're facing here? A big part of it, of course, is funding right now because things are very uncertain with COVID. But can someone speak to that? Justin, do you feel
Yeah,
like you can speak to
yeah.
that?
Well, and I'm glad on the last question, Stephen and Aaron emphasizing the land use side of the equation, because it is, it's two pieces. You know, transportation is a demand in response to a supply, and the supply is land use and development form. So we do have to get that right. And I'm happy to say that the city is taking that seriously and going to be undertaking a pretty comprehensive update to our zoning code to align those sorts of policies. You know, challenges, Aaron mentioned political will. I think even broadly, but related to that, it's culture change. And Stephen talked a little bit about this as well. You know, you could say Columbus is already a 20-minute city if you're driving by car. You can just get just about anywhere in 20 or so minutes, at least under normal, you know, pre-pandemic conditions, except for maybe right at the peak of rush hour. So we just, you know, historically, at least until very recently, have been a city where most people have been perfectly fine to drive because it's not been that hard to drive. And in a lot of the cities where we see, you know, those different approaches, it's been in response to growing pains. You know, the congestion gets to a point where, okay, we don't have any more room. We can't keep adding travel lanes. We have to have some other options. I think we're just right now as a city and a region kind of entering the growing pain phase over the past few years. We still don't have the level of congestion of an Atlanta or a DC or an Austin. But the good thing is we also don't want we don't want to be in that position. So we're in a position to look around at what's happened in other cities and I think learn from them in advance of us getting to that point and proactively make some infrastructure and policy decisions that can help mitigate some of those downstream impacts of the growth that we're going to have. But it does require a conversation with the larger community about change, and change is always hard. Change is hard when we're talking about reallocating roadway space. You know, I experienced it here in my own neighborhood in Clintonville. We did a road diet, added bike lanes a couple of years ago. Drivers still like to complain about it. When our data actually shows that it has not really impacted travel times in any negative way. It has actually gotten travel speeds down closer to the speed limit, but still not as close to the speed limit as we'd like. And it's safer because we have fewer severe crashes given the way we designed the street. But it's still change, and people struggle with change. And so we have that on how we think about our transportation infrastructure. We have that issue on that land use side as well, because you know, we're talking about more compact, denser development that is more transit and multimodal supportive. And it's a common refrain. It's fine somewhere else, but not in my neighborhood. those are hard conversations that we have to have as a larger community, as a city and as a region, about how all of this does fit together. And if we do it right, with the right combination of designs, both on the infrastructure side and the development side, there actually are benefits to the community. So a lot of this is frankly just conversation that needs to happen, and a little bit of education, and understanding, real authentic community engagement to understand what people's concerns are and demonstrate that we're prepared to address those concerns. But there's something for everybody if we tackle some of these things and do it right.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the audience now for some questions. Katie.
Yeah, we have some great questions. The first one, Justin just touched on it a little bit, but I'd like to hear more about plans to improve walkability in Columbus. How will that work with zoning restrictions on stores and residential buildings?
I want to make sure I'm thinking about, I'm interpreting that question in terms of zoning restrictions on what specific, did you say just commercial and residential?
Residential buildings and housing.
Well, so from a couple of different angles, by code, all developments, if it's a new greenfield development site that doesn't have any walking, any pedestrian or bike infrastructure, it doesn't have sidewalks, a sidewalk or what we call a shared use path, essentially a wider trail that you could bike or walk on, is required to be built with that development. Now, so on the development side, in the more suburban areas, that happens kind of piecemeal, development by development. You'll see sections of sidewalks get built and eventually they get connected together as development continues. So that already happens. We are in the process of examining what specific type of infrastructure between a sidewalk and a shared use path we want to require of developments in certain areas of the city and in certain roadway contexts. What we've been learning over time is we have a lot of places in the somewhat more suburban areas of the city where we've required sidewalks to be built over time. And in hindsight, it would have been way better if they were shared use paths that people could bike on too, especially where, we have roadways, 50% of our city does not, of our city streets don't have at least some pedestrian accommodation on at least one side. So in areas where maybe we don't have a whole lot of right of way and we might only get a sidewalk or a path on one side of the street, at least for some time, we're starting to shift towards kind of a default where in a lot of places, let's build a shared use path so that we get double the value. People could walk or could bike. And I think that's really important in those lower density areas where people are a little bit further away. So they're probably more likely to make that 15-minute trip by bike than by walking to get to something that's maybe a moderate distance away. So that's one approach. And then again, just on the zoning side, encouraging and facilitating compact and interconnected development patterns so that you have more people that are in a position to actually use that pedestrian infrastructure rather than having to drive somewhere.
Thank you. Next question, can you comment on the impact of COVID-19 on commercial truck volumes, especially home delivery? Will increased truck volumes be part of the new normal, and how would that impact mobility strategies and investments?
Who wants to take that? That's a good question.
I can take a stab at it. I wonder, Stephen, if folks at MORPC, maybe have been looking at this as well. I don't have numbers on this, but I think it's pretty clear, just anecdotally, and we can all see it outside of our own windows, the Amazon and other deliveries are certainly up. And that was an upward trend happening already. And I think data in other places has borne this out. It has been increasing, and I think there likely is a longer, a sustained trend there, where maybe this is accelerating the use of delivery for goods and maybe groceries, and maybe that's a consideration in the idea of the 15-minute city too, that maybe some trips are actually turning into deliveries. We have Uber even transitioning, at least right now, to grocery delivery. So maybe that's also an opportunity to just shift the types of trips. Now, I think what I'd like to see is a little more strategy and coordination around how that's happening, because I will see UPS and Amazon, well, just let's take Amazon for an example. I'll see an Amazon van on my street, dropping something off in a neighbor's house, and then either the same one or maybe a different one an hour later comes by and 5 houses down is dropping off. Well, it would have been great to combine that trip. So I think those are things that are going to need some research and some conversation with some of these companies, so that we don't just have more and more freight and delivery oriented trips actually adding to congestion. That would be a concern.
Steve, did you want to pick that up?
I think Justin covered it pretty well. The only thing I would add is to jump off of what he said about coordination. I think there has to be some guidance from government agencies on how this all works out. For it just to be to evolve as a market-driven force, I think we're going to run into some issues with congestion and with some quality of life. So yeah, that's all I'd have to add.
Okay.
What can the average citizen do to help these mobility ideas become a reality?
That's a great question. Let's go to everyone for this. Let's start with Aaron.
So I think this kind of goes back to the idea of culture change and demonstrating support for some of these ideas that are big changes. And like Justin said, change is hard. And so anywhere, whether it's elected officials, through community meetings, demonstrate that you support ideas like that, participating in processes that are around these planning things. For example, Vision Zero is going through stages of community feedback and input on the strategies. They have an interactive tool to provide information and data that you can't really get from some of the data sources, but is housed with us citizens around the city moving through our lives. So those are all great places to give your knowledge and your stamp of approval to advancing these kinds of initiatives. There are lots of, I'd say, nonprofit organizations or other groups who are trying to, support. I'm looking at, faces of 3 different, government, quasi-governmental agencies that are leading some of these plans. And so there are groups that you can get involved with that are trying to support that work, lend support in, all different kinds of municipalities, whether, it's complete street initiatives, whether it's the Link Us, whether it's Vision Zero in Columbus. There are groups that can help you amplify that voice and give you guidance on where to plug in. But when it comes down to culture change, it's also, person to person. And so just talking to your neighbors or your family about things happening in your neighborhood, ideas you maybe see and why you think they would be great can help. And I think too, picking a different mode every once in a while is another way to do that. I'll say I personally always try to make sure when I ride my bike somewhere, I park it in a really highly visible place so that someone sees it and goes, oh, you can ride your bike here. Or when I talk to people about, oh, I took a bus to this meeting, and they go, oh, but you took a bus to this meeting at the airport? Well, yeah, let me tell you about this thing that exists. And so the more of us that do those things and have those conversations, the more it becomes real people involved, and it makes it less scary to make the jump yourself. And so I think all of those are kind of small and big kinds of steps that can help support this work across the region.
Kim, what do you think? We should all get CODA passes, but besides that, what should we do to support?
Well, I actually think I think Aaron actually nailed it really well. There's a lot of initiatives going on. We are all quasi-governmental. You can get involved with any of these things. A lot of stuff's online. We need to hold more of these webinars and Facebook Live events. This is a lot of fun. I really look forward to also including the private sector and the development sector and trying to understand how that partnership could really make a lot of this stuff happen, because there's nothing more inefficient than getting off of a bus and you're in front of two huge parking lots that you have to walk through to get to where you need to go. And so that's really important. I actually, if we have a minute, can we address the question being cities? How will this change the need for public transportation?
Sure, but real quick because we're out of time.
We are working very closely with MORPC on understanding county connections and transfers and working with our county counterparts, as well as understanding micro-mobility options and first mile, last mile options to make it easier for people to get onto the larger system. That's all I had to say about that.
Okay, I think we're out of time right now. Thanks for joining this conversation. I think it was a very important conversation. And I hope that everyone listening to this will learn something and also will take actions as a private citizen to help transform our community, because it's certainly something that we need. As the panelists said, you know, this pandemic has really exposed some of the weaknesses and vulnerabilities in our mobility system and our land use system, as the panelists said, here in Central Ohio. And even though this is an unfortunate event in our history, it is an opportunity to rethink what we've done, and I hope that this webinar is the first step in starting that conversation. So thank you, wonderful panelists. We appreciate you joining this conversation. And audience, please join us again on September 18th for the impacts of COVID on food security systems. And as always, this recording will be posted. Go to cura.osu.edu to sign up for any of these events, or sign up for our newsletter, and you'll never miss any of these conversations or events that Cura tries to bring to the community. Thank you very much. Everyone have a good day. Be safe and be well.
Thank you.